Hi, I'm Thelma English, and welcome back to my survey of American literature. We are ready for session 14 today. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the privilege and for the legal freedom to homeschool here in Oregon. We pray that those who fight for our rights here in Oregon would be boosted and have the energy and the effort and the money that they need to continue this battle for us so that we can educate our families freely as we see fit and according to your will. We thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. Welcome back. Welcome to the girls in Oklahoma, and welcome to anyone else who's listening in. Someone volunteered last week to read from the Valley of Vision, read a devotion. You should pause the video now for that volunteer to read. Okay, we're back. Session 14, we're continuing with our study of Thoreau. You're turning in your paper now. Go ahead and get that out of your notebook and get that turned in now, the Puritan to Romantic paper. And in a few minutes, we'll take a quiz on civil disobedience. And then we're going to be looking at worldviews again today. We'll talk about the exam just a little bit. If you have all of your quizzes and your first exam, then you're ready for the next exam. Exams are cumulative, so you will see some of the same questions that you saw on the first exam. You'll see those same questions on this exam, and you'll see them on the third exam and on the fourth exam. It is cumulative, and it is a way to help you remember and review. So hang on to those exams and quizzes, and then you're set for the exam. Reading this week, we're reading from Walden. Excuse me. We all have the Dover edition of Walden. I also have a very pretty illustrated edition, but I'm using my Dover copy of Walden today so that we'll all look alike and have the same book. Do get that out now, and I hope that you have a pen or a highlighter or something, because at the end of the presentation today, we'll be going through quite a few pages from Walden. And if you are reading with a pen or a highlighter, you can mark all of the important sections, and that will help you in your reading this week. You are reading either 20, 30, or 40 pages or more from Walden this week, and you have a project that is due next week. So this is a little bit of reading, but it's very easy reading. I think you'll enjoy it. There's no syllabus reading. If you're grades 7 and 8, this is tough reading for you. You're reading 20 pages that you can pick from. If you start reading a couple of pages and you want to go somewhere else through the book, then write down the pages. If you're reading random pages, then write down the page numbers and then have a parent initial that and turn that into your teacher, the facilitator, so that you can show that you did read 20 pages or 30 or 40. So depending on your grade level, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 are reading either 20, 30, or 40 pages, and you select those from Walden. I hope to give you ideas of the pages that you might want to read from the quotes that I will highlight later on. So identify the pages you read. Expect to use 150, 200, 250 words minimum to narrate or journal the story of what you read. For this assignment, you can use an outline format. He talks about ants. He talks about the weather. He talks about an old lady who comes to see him. And I finally figured out that that's nature, Mother Nature, that he visits with. You can do a journal synopsis where you say page 3, he talked about this, this, this. Page 20, he talked about this and this. Or your notes, you can take notes with page numbers and notes, casual notes. As long as I can read them, I'll accept those. An alternate assignment, and the more fun assignment, is to write your own Walden style journal, either a serious nature journal or satirical, or even from a Christian viewpoint. No essay format is required. Enjoy nature, record your thoughts in words and illustrations. It is too bad this project happens during the fall or winter, and so you can't really go outside and and be barefoot and lay around in your backyard, because if your backyard is like mine, it's all full of puddles and rain. But do record your thoughts and words in illustrations. Feel free to glue things into your journal. Handwritten is just fine. You don't have to use computer paper. I'll show you a few samples here in a couple of minutes. Next week, bring the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass to class next session. You are going to really like Frederick Douglass. He is a powerful, powerful man. And I think you'll be rooting for him from page 1 of his narrative. He's an incredible historical figure here in America. And if you have any Black in your family, you'll like him especially because he's Black. All right, one of my students named Anna did a Walden style journal from a Christian perspective. And you can see that she glued little flower pieces in and wrote things. Can you imagine being a squirrel or a bird? To have your biggest problem being to find seeds. I believe that is how God created us to live, to never worry about what will happen next, but to put our trust fully in our Creator. Look, see the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And so are you not more valuable? She's quoting Matthew 6:26. So she did a really good job. She had some verses here. She glued in a few pieces from nature. Yes, I realize they'll all wilt and dry. And she used various colors, and she wrote it by hand. But it was as though she was there at Walden. And this is her perspective, which is a very Christian perspective, talking about even his design. This is another page. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come, from 2 Corinthians 5. And she says, one of my favorite things about nature is the changes in seasons. Watching the world go from life to death, and back to life again, is one of the most amazing things I've seen. It makes me think that God designed it that way to remind us of Christ's resurrection and our new life in him. What a beautiful perspective. And this is from a young student. I believe she was a junior when she wrote this last year. So these are some profound theological thoughts. And this journal sample is from an actual artist. She was a student, and she is quite the artist, quite the artist. She painted a Winnie the Pooh scene for my granddaughter that hangs in her room, of Pooh and his friends playing Pooh sticks, if you know the main stories of Winnie the Pooh. And she's done a beautiful watercolor, and she is making her little comments about time and scenery. All nature is a congratulation, and you have cause momentarily to bless yourself, the greatest gains. So she's writing like a naturalist. This one is harder to see because it's written in pencil. A student has burned the edges to make it look old, very old, but she did it all in pencil, and so it's a little harder to see. And this is one by a young man named Asher, who does have quite a bit of talent sketching. And nature, what is nature? Nature is life. Nature is everything. To be truly one with thyself, and to truly acknowledge nature as the true God. So you can see the perspective that he's taking. He's taking a perspective just like Henry David Thoreau. So you can do either. And this is from one of my granddaughters. One day as I attended my garden, I saw a deer grazing peacefully with her 2 fawns. They ate herbs and browse along with some grass. One of the grasses they seemed to like was this kind, and she glued a little glob of grass in there. I found it odd and did not appreciate the taste as much as the deer did. As I watched the deer graze peacefully with her 2 fawns, I could not help but think of the eloquence in which the deer spoke to her fawns, as if saying, "Here, eat this grass, for it is of better taste than the other grass." This made me delight in my efforts and take humble pride in my garden, which spanned as far as the eye could see, though trees and hills hindered much of my vision. I took pleasure in it nonetheless. My garden was full of simple flowers and clovers, bushes and berries, and many, many trees. I named each of the trees to the name they seemed to say. One was Delinda, one Emma, one Carl, for it looked like a Carl, one John, one Larry, and two seemed to be Joes. And I really enjoyed that. She's got just a dash of humor there, but not so much to make it not fun anymore. This one was glued to fabric, and I did not get a very good picture of it, but it was rolled up and then a ribbon tied around it. It was pretty cool. And so you might want to do something that you can save, whether it is satirical or whether it is in Thoreau's style, love of nature, but you can also write it from a Christian theological perspective with a love of nature, but looking through nature to see nature's God. This artist has about the same skill level as I do, and I just want you to know that that's okay. If you don't have a lot of skill, this is good enough. This is plenty good enough. This student folded several pieces of paper together, put a cover on it, stapled it in the middle, and made it into a temporary journal, and then journaled through the best that he could do. And I like that. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about worldview before the quiz. This is from way back in 2009. If you look in the upper right-hand corner here, you'll see it. In 2009, I was still using a whiteboard in class, and I was using PowerPoint, but I really didn't know how to build anything in PowerPoint. And I ended up using the whiteboard, and then I liked it enough that I took a photo of it. You can see these building blocks are very similar to some of the worldview charts that you have in your syllabus. And you can see up in the left-hand corner of the whiteboard that I wrote 1600 years. For 1600 years after Jesus Christ, the basic worldview was theism. That was the accepted worldview, that you were either Christian or Jewish, if you were Western anyway. And that followed through until about 1740, which would be 1740, 1750 is about the time that theism started coming in. Now, when we look at, or that deism started coming in. So theism, we look at the building blocks of theism, look away to the bottom row, and you see of the theism blocks that the bottom idea is a theological idea. It's a theological worldview, and it is based solidly on God. And you would put right above God the Bible. It says compact, constitutions, covenant, and you could put the Bible there also. Sacred, the idea, what do they think of social contracts? They believe in making covenants with one another and making compacts with one another and writing constitutions and then sticking by their word. When you jump over to the deistic worldview, you see it's a mechanical worldview based solidly on science. And what is the social contract? Well, it can change. The social contract can change according to the circumstance. And look over to romanticism. The bottom line, it is a subjective worldview, and that means it changes. It's always changing. And that's a difficult worldview, and that is where we remain today. We are American romantics. Even if you are a solid theist, you are probably romantic in quite a few ways, as most Americans are, which means it is based on emotions. And so a good television show, for example, might change your mind about abortion or same-sex marriage, something like that. A good presentation, or perhaps a Disney special might convince you that Shakespeare is not really the author of Shakespeare, someone who does a really good job with a presentation. Your worldview is shifting. It's individual and it changes. And a social contract is not so much needed because even marriage is thought to be temporary for as long as love shall last. So marriage, you look at the building block of theological views on marriage, and it's a sacred thing. It's between one man, one woman. It's lifelong, and it is sacred. It is not to be taken lightly. It's done in front of people. The wedding ceremony is said in front of people. There are witnesses. It's a contract. What is marriage? According to the deistic, it's mostly a traditional marriage. They're going to stick with that. But once you get to romanticism, of course, it's going to be non-traditional because you are now following your heart. If love leaves the marriage, the idea of working to get the love back, only if both people are interested in doing that will it work. Otherwise, it's time for divorce, move on, and try again. This works especially well for men. You might have a romantic uncle in your family, somebody who's been married 5 or 6 or even 7 times. If they've been married 5, 6, 7 times, they're romantic. They are following their heart. They're not up for the hard work that to put into a relationship. They're romantic. And what about the Bible? What does a theological view think about the Bible? Well, they believe the Bible is absolute truth, that it's God breathed. It doesn't matter whether you agree with the Bible or not. If the Bible says it, and you study into the Greek and the Hebrew, and that's what it says, then that's what it says. It's the truth for all people, for all time, in all places. It does not change according to society. If society favors a particular sin, say alcoholism, that doesn't matter. It's still going to be bad. If society favors another particular sin, say sacrificing children on the altar of abortion, so that you might have a better job or more money or a better life, that doesn't fly with the Bible, does it? Not at all. Or then the Bible is absolute truth. You can't change the Bible if you change your mind. It's just too bad. And what does the deist do with the Bible? They apply science to the Bible. And that means all the miracles disappear. Thomas Jefferson actually trimmed out all of the miracles out of his New Testament. And you can even get a printed copy of that now, something with all the miracles clipped out. And then Jesus becomes a little easier for a non-believer to believe. What about the Bible as far as from the Romantic? Well, the Romantics are going to say, well, it's a good book, but it doesn't apply to everybody, only if you want it to apply to you. Very, very subjective, means it changes all the time. What about nature? What are the views of nature? Theistic view, the deistic view, and the romantic view. Nature, well, for a theist, Adam was the caretaker of the earth. We know that from Genesis 1:28. The earth was made for him, and he's supposed to be a caregiver, caretaker of the earth. He is supposed to take care of it, but he's not obeying the earth or worshiping the earth, but he is supposed to be working and taking care of his garden. What does deism say about nature? Well, of course, they're going to say, examine it, study nature, find out what makes it tick. And so we come into all of these sciences. You've got oceanology, geology, zoology, biology, chemistry, all of these sciences appear to examine and explore nature and to explore even the human body. So human biology also, to explore the human body. And what about romanticism, their view of nature? We realize by the time we get to romanticism, like Henry David Thoreau, that nature is our mother, and we're looking to become one with nature. We're looking to have a sublime, that's a key word. We're looking to have a sublime experience with nature. And nature becomes a type of a goddess and a mother. Nature can provide solace and healing and wisdom, all of these things. And you as a Christian may say, well, I go backpacking and camping, and nature does kind of provide all of those things. Well, is that really true? Or is it when we get out into nature? I used to backpack. And when I was out in nature, especially by myself, backpacking by myself, I felt closer to God, away from phones and walls and ceilings and people, other people. You did feel more alone with God, but I did not feel one with nature. I felt closer to God through his creation. The Christian looks through, as Alexander Pope said in his essay on man, but that's Britlit, the Christian looks through nature to nature's God. What about human life? What are those 3 views? Well, the theistic view is that human life, we're created in the image of God. Therefore, we are sacred, and our bodies are the temple of God. And that's why there are many things we don't do. We would not kill an unborn child, even in the example of rape, for example, which occurs almost never, but that's the example that is usually held up for people. But if you ask a real theist, a real Christian, even in the instance of rape, is it really correct? Is it theologically correct to kill the innocent victim? of the crime. And no, of course it would not be. Would not be correct to kill the innocent victim. What about a deist? How do they look at human life? They look at the human body as a machine. Just like the earth is a machine, they look at the human body and all the systems as machinery. And what about romantics? How do they look at human life? Well, it all depends. For example, if you're expecting a baby and you want a baby, then it's a good thing. If you don't want a baby, then it's a parasite. It's a bad thing. And it's your body, even though the baby's not part of your body, but you are hosting this child. And if you don't want the child, nobody's going to make you keep it. It's all about feelings. It's all about emotions. And imagine the emotions that go through a woman when she's pregnant. We're really emotional. Ask your mom, ask your grandma. Well, what about law? How does a theist look at law? And a theist says, well, whatever God says, that's what we're going to do. If God says it's bad, we're not going to do it. If God says it's good, that's what we're going to try and do. It's all about the original intent of the writers who wrote the Bible. What does a deist say about law? They say, well, law is conscience. They don't want to talk too much about God. They might talk about the prime mover, the divine hand. Today we say things like the intelligent design. We don't say intelligent designer, but that is the implication. And behind intelligent design is there is an intelligent designer. And so it's according to your conscience. And what about the romantic? Well, for the romantic, law is what seems reasonable. And that's why law fluctuates so much from state to state and from decade to decade. What about human nature? What does a theist think about human nature? When you're born, now the theist says we are born sinful. We need to be reborn. We are marred. We have a marred image, and we must be regenerated or reborn to get closer to the Lord and imitate Christ better. What about a deist? The deist says man is born good. It is a society that is ruining him. And the romantic says that especially. The romantic says you are born perfect. If you could just stay in nature and not be in society, live in the country by yourself or with as few people as possible, you would remain good and perfect. And we talked about that last week with Captain James Cook exploring, and he went to Hawaii and just thought, wow, they're so peaceful here. They're happy. They're much happier than we Europeans because they don't have all of that bad emphasis, and they just live with one another so peacefully. And then, of course, he did end up having a falling out with some of the Hawaiians, and they clubbed him to death. So this is what happens sometimes. Missionaries go into places where they've never seen a Westerner, and they expect that they're going to find peace and tranquility and everyone just living peacefully. But what do we really find? In the last century, as people went into remote tribes and areas where no one had ever had any Western influence, what they find is cannibalism and abuse of the weakest members, which would be animals, children, and women. Especially women are very vulnerable because women have the children, women bear the children, they have to take care of the children. And so people do not start out perfect. People without instruction, without any godly instruction, can be horrifying, terrifying. So, what do you think of that? All right, that kind of gives you an idea, doesn't it? So we redefine truth, for example, gets redefined by a theist. Truth is truth. Jesus said, I am the truth, the way, and the life, and that's it. It doesn't change. A deist says, well, truth, we better make sure this is the truth. We better check it out with science. Can the waters really part? Well, no, they really can't, according to the laws of science. So that part of the Bible really isn't true. What about marriage? We redefine marriage. So we're using some of the same words. We're still using the word truth, but it means something completely different. And we're using the word marriage. And what it really means is two people. I was going to say two adults, but I think that's going to fall by the wayside in the next 5 years or so. Two consenting persons is game for any kind of marriage. And redefining God. You can have your God, we can have our God. All gods are the same. All views, all religious views lead to the same God. There's only one God called by many names. And then you are ignoring what Jesus said. And remember, that we talked about last week. What are you going to do about Jesus? Who do you say that I am? Said Jesus to his disciples. Who do you say he is? Is he a crackpot? Or is he God? Or is he a liar? What is he? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human? And is human life more valuable than animal life? Think about the three views here, the three worldviews, how they value human life and how they value disabled persons or unborn persons. It's now all about diversity and tolerance, but not just tolerance, tolerating the views that are held by the most people is what tolerance is all about. But then we're blind to other things. For example, the treatment of women in Islam. Right now, there's a big thing going on in Iran because there was a female protester who was beaten to death by the police and turned out and was almost dead, had been just beaten to death. And they've had uprising by women not wearing their head covering properly or not wearing them at all, going out by the thousands. Hundreds have been arrested. And yet we in the Western world say, well, Islam's, sure, it's just the same as Christianity. It's just the same. And we completely try to pretend that the part about the abuse of women doesn't really exist because we want to say we have to tolerate all worldviews. And because we don't see too much of that in America, we don't have to see it with our own eyes very often. And so the basic building blocks, it's not a theological today. It's not a mechanical worldview. It's not even really subjective where it's changing all the time. Today's worldview is based on absurdity. Non-logic is what today's worldview is. And it's all about me. It's whatever I want. And so whatever, you've heard that, you say that and you get fined 50 cents or something, whatever. That's what today's worldview is. I think you're starting at this point to get the idea of worldview. And of course, history judges worldview. So there are things we'll have to answer for. So these are types of questions that you might see on your exam. What is a theistic view of man's relationship to nature? And then you'd have A, B, C, multiple choice to choose from that. What is a romantic view of man's relationship to nature? And you'd have multiple choice to choose from. What is the deistic view of man's relationship to nature? And have multiple choice. And of course, the theistic view of man's relationship to nature is to worship God, see nature and worship God and glorify God. What about the romantic view of man's relationship to nature? Well, worshiping creation, and Mother Nature, getting healing and solace and comfort. All the things we normally would go to God for, we would go to nature for if you are a romantic. What about the deist? Nature's all about examining it, cutting it up, looking at it, finding out what makes it grow, what makes it bloom, how do the seasons change. It's all about science. So we're looking for that type of worldview. If you miss the exam, and I'm usually quite firm on this, unless you have some horrible disease or get the measles or something that nobody gets anymore, unless you're really ill and your teacher or parent makes an excuse for you, if you miss the exam, you write the paper. It's very common for a student to not feel well the morning of the exam. And then you don't take the exam. You get an extra week to study. You get to talk to your friends, what's on the exam, that type of thing. And it's just not fair to everyone else who prepares for the exam. So if you miss the exam, you're going to write the paper. And that means I will hand you a blank copy of the exam, and you will write a paper that goes through all of the questions on the exam, answering them in sentence structure as though you are teaching the exam. That's what you do if you miss the exam. So don't miss the exam. All right, let's pause and take our quiz on civil disobedience. Okay, that wasn't bad at all, was it? What is Thoreau recommending civil disobedience against? Let's review the syllabus pages from last week. If you are not reading your syllabus pages, that's our textbook. It's like getting a history textbook and not reading it, just going to class. You must read your syllabus pages, have your parent initial those every week that you have read those. Do read your syllabus pages and read them with a highlighter. Okay, what's Thoreau's civil disobedience all about? He says it's about the right to just treatment. People should be treated justly. And that you have the right to disobey an unjust state, even if you go to jail for it. And then you get a lawyer and you sue and you go all the way to the Supreme Court and you hope that you win your case. But you have the right. He says we should have the right to disobey an unjust state. Remember, he didn't want to pay that poll tax. He didn't pay property taxes because he didn't own property. But everyone had to pay a poll tax. And part of that poll tax was actually supporting slavery, things that were surrounding slavery. So he didn't want to pay that poll tax. So he had the right to disobey an unjust state. He didn't want to pay taxes for it. Think how frustrated your mom and dad and your grandma and grandpa get when they realize that their tax money is going to fund federally funded abortion clinics. It makes them furious, doesn't it? It makes them very angry. And if you don't pay that, you're going to jail. If you don't pay that tax and you can't figure out what that percentage of your tax is. But that's what Thoreau's talking about. We should have the right to disobey an unjust state. And that's why states have individual rights, so that one state should have the right to say no abortions here and no tax money goes to abortion. And another state can say, we want everyone to be able to have an abortion. We'll even pay your way here. Then people can pay tax money and pay for that. And if you don't like it, you move. He wanted us to have the right to disagree in worldview. And you do have that right to think that something is sacred or not sacred. You have that right as an American, the right to think as he chose. That's an important right. You can't force someone to think the way that they do. And we see some of that going on in 2022, where we make something illegal. For example, we talked about last week with the 14th Amendment, that the 14th Amendment was saying that you had to have, remember, your copy of the Constitution. And where's the 14th Amendment at? The 14th Amendment that said, I'm flipping to my copy now. If you get that first, you go ahead and just start reading it out loud. The 14th Amendment that said you had to have the same, I'm almost there. Should have had it open. It's on syllabus page 130. 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. You have your time in court, you get your day in court, you get due process, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Laws must protect everyone equally. When this was just after the Civil War, remember, look at the date here, 1868, and this meant that all of these things applied to the former slaves, that they now had equal protection. And what the Southern states tried to do with the Jim Crow laws was to say, well, they do have equal protection, they're just equal, but they're separate. The schools are separate, the ball fields are separate, the libraries are separate, the trades are separate, the restaurants are separate, the drinking fountains are separate, everything's separate, but they're equal. And of course, they weren't equal at all, and they were not separate. But when we apply the 14th Amendment to the LGBTQIA plus community, then all of a sudden, if you deny anything to somebody from the LGBTQIA plus community, then it's just like denying that to someone because of their skin color or their culture. I don't like to say race because there's only one human race. But if your skin is darker, if you are from Africa, or if you are from India, if you're from some of the Arab countries, if you're from Spain, anywhere where skin is dark and you are discriminated against because of dark skin, that's wrong. You can't do that. But to apply that to a homosexual, lesbian, gay, queer, what are all the letters do we have? LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer, and everything else. If you apply that, then that gets kind of tricky. If you decide you don't want to hire that person, or you don't want to bake a wedding cake for them and deliver it to their wedding ceremony, something like that. So it gets a little tricky when you apply the 14th Amendment across the board, not when you when you apply sexual preference, when you put it in that same protected category. So he wants the right to think as he chose. He wants the right to reject society from Mother Nature. He wants to be able to go out and live in nature, not earn any money if he doesn't need any money, just earn enough to buy his food. And he wants the right to not pay taxes that support slavery, just like your parents and grandparents probably don't want to pay taxes that pay for abortions. And so he is protesting here, and he has that right to protest. It is his civil disobedience. Now, we're going to review a little bit of Romanticism because it applies in the same way. For the Romantics, the dominant worldview was an emotional worldview. So it was subjective, it changed all the time. Man would find his identity in his relationship to nature. Belief in God had not prevented that bloody French Revolution, 1798. Many Romantics had very deep French roots. And so they think this is the way that what you do, you overthrow. The French Revolution had cost many lives. The concept of man's innate goodness was questioned. Are people really born good like the Romantics say? Look at what they did in France. Man could not look to God, they thought. Man could not look to invention, and they thought they couldn't look to science. Man would have to look to himself and find solace in nature, his mother nature, and in himself. Into American literary history walk Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, disciples of William Wordsworth, the European. Now, we didn't mention Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology last week. This was published in 1827. I always think this is kind of funny. He made geology into a true science, Principles of Geology. Now, the geological processes could now account for how the Earth has assumed its present condition. Earthquakes, floods, erosion, and eruptions, given enough time, and that's the key, given enough time, could explain all of the previous mysteries. You don't need to any longer believe in creation, miracles, or revelation, because everything could be explained. And that is when in comes social Darwinism. If we have evolved from animals, from apes, it changes everything about how we treat one another, because some people may be further along on the evolutionary scale than others. And I think you see where I'm going with this. But given enough time, your imagination could say, well, I think that could happen if you actually gave it millions or billions or hundreds of thousands of years. The problem is, take any example that you like. Take the example of a finely tuned Swiss watch. Swiss watches used to have hundreds or dozens of little tiny little gears. It's before Apple digital watches, and little watches had tiny gears that all worked beautiful together to have perfect time and kept time, never lost time, perfect time. And they were expensive watches, but you only have to go back about 100 years. And that was the standard for the best watch you could get. Now, disassemble that watch into this couple of hundred little pieces or more that are inside that watch and put it in a little paper bag, all disassembled, and shake it. Now, if you shook that bag for 100,000 years, is it ever going to make a watch? What if you shook it for 1,000,000 years? Could it ever become a watch? What if you shook it for 1,000,000,000 years? Could it ever become a watch? And that's having all the pieces that you need, all designed, every piece that you need that's going to fit, that's having all the pieces. No matter how much time you give creation, you simply can't get something out of nothing. In this way, evolution was the natural next step, though. Biology was formed in 1839 when a German, Theodor Schwann, formulated the theory that all living things originate and grow in small structural units called cells. And actually, the ancient Greeks thought of this 1,800 years, 2,000 years before this man, because they already had the idea of atoms and cells. The cell pointed to a common denominator of all organic structures and challenged the established concept of the fixity of the species. And this is what the Bible calls kinds in Genesis. So if you go to Genesis, the first couple of chapters, and where it says kind, it's the fixity of a species. With the fixity of species questioned, the door was opened to more challenges. So if we're all made from cells, then it did kind of sound like, well, what if enough cells went through enough changes? One thing, if you gave it enough time, could become another thing, another species, another kind. Species is also found in Genesis 1:24 and 25 as well. The Latin basically meant, the Latin, that would be Jerome's Latin from AD 300. Uh, the Latin meant the biblical kind, but this word carried over into English and other languages that have some Latin influence. It means a kind, a form, or a sort. Another word that was commonly used for a kind in the Latin Vulgus was a genus. Genus. And I'm taking this straight out of Answers in Genesis, one of my favorite creation sites with Ken Ham, God bless his soul. But evolutionist theory always comes down to you take nothing, you add all the time you can conceive of, and a whole bunch of chance and accidents, and that equals everything that we have today. And it takes, I believe, more faith to believe this than it does to simply read and believe Genesis. This is evident in Genesis 1. In both cases, these two words were used for the Hebrew word mean or kind. For example, there's a dog kind, there's a cat kind, and so on. For example, cats can change, but they cannot become dogs. There are hybrid animals. You've seen the, what do they call these? The Bengals. You've seen Bengal kittens in pictures or something. They can change, but they can't become dogs. There are hybrid animals, but there are no new genetic material has been added. These are all done by mankind. This doesn't happen in the wild. There have been a few instances of kinds cross mating when they're in close proximity, especially when they are held by humans so that they are safe and they're in close proximity. But for example, two different kinds of elephants, African and Asian elephants that were contained together somewhere, once did produce a baby, but the baby only lived for a few days or a few weeks because you just can't. These hybrid animals don't have new genetic material. And that's what evolution depends on, that you're going to have new genetic material. Hybrids are almost without exception human engineered. Humans have done it. And they have shorter lifespans almost without exception. And they're usually sterile almost without exception. In the case of, for example, these Bengal kittens, an F1 is a cat that has been mated not naturally, but in a lab with a wildcat. That would be an F1. It's half wildcat. An F2 is where you take the half wildcat and then mate it with a regular cat. That's an F2 Bengal. And an F3 Bengal would be another generation down, so that you probably still have extra claws and not extra claws, but sharper, longer claws and teeth, but much less vicious. The farther down you go, the less pure the animal is. But no new genetic material has been added. This is something that mankind decided would be really cool to do. Essential questions are not answered in evolution. Well, they're still not answering the origin of life or the fixity of species. Kinds do not change. No new genetic material gets added. And the second law of thermodynamics, which means which of course you know is as soon as something is born, it begins to decay. We don't get better, we begin to decay. I'm 65 years old. I know that. So definition of species has changed. The original definition of species was a broad dog species. And now when we talk about species, we're talking about several different dog species. So science is always tricking us and getting more difficult. And I'm not a scientist, but I do know that Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis is my favorite creation resource. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, only a year after reading his friend Alfred Wallace's unpublished book, proposing the same theory. So he reads his friend's unpublished book, and a year later, he publishes On the Origin of the Species. Wasn't that a nice neighborly thing to do? Given enough time, and that's the key to evolution, including human, animal and plant species could all have derived from one source through intermediary mutations that survived through natural selections. Now, the problem is the irony there. Natural selection stands in opposition to scientific analysis. Scientific analysis is where you create something, you experiment, and you try to prove it through an experiment. You present a theory, and then you put it out for the scientific community, and they can either say, I agree or I disagree, and they try to prove you right or they try to prove you wrong. And this has been completely in opposition to scientific analysis and, of course, lack of proof. Mutant forms are always weaker, always. They're not stronger, and they rarely survive to reproduce. Evolution does provide a convenient worldview, however, which is completely devoid of God. It is a worldview that is completely devoid of God. It's a very handy worldview for our culture that does not want to believe in God. Evolution kind of gives you a way out of church. Nietzsche said, and of course, Nietzsche, I love to quote Nietzsche. I picked up all of his books. I got them used. I hate to give the publisher or the remaining family any royalties, so I always buy bad books used so that I'm only supporting my local bookstore. He said, man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman, a rope over an abyss. So man it's an evolutionary rope. And at one end, we're an animal. And at the other end, we could be the Superman, the Übermensch in German. And we're on this rope. It's a rope over an abyss. And this is from Thus Spake Zarathustra. And what does that mean? It means that we started as animals and we could become supermen if we could help evolution out a little bit. And too many people have read this, and people like, who can you think of who tried to get rid of entire people groups? Yeah, Adolf Hitler. Right. If you could just clarify the gene pool, if you could get rid of the people in the gene pool that you don't want to have there, don't let them reproduce, sterilize them, then mankind could become better faster if you could clarify the gene pool. And this is scary. Ape ancestry. If we are from apes, it denies special creation. It denies that man is created in God's image. It denies original sin. It denies redemption from original sin. It makes the work of Christ on the cross a moot point and makes personal salvation unnecessary. The reason? Can you accept sin and death before Adam? If there was any sin before Adam, then Adam and Eve are not original sin. If there's any death, then there was suffering, sin, and death before Adam. You can't have that. You can't have both. You can't have it both ways. Excuse me. Salvation becomes an emotional response to relieve ourselves of the guilt imposed on us by 2,000 years of Christianity. And this is really sad, but this is what gets revealed in a romantic worldview or in an evolutionary worldview. We feel guilty when we do bad things just because we've had 2,000 years of Christians telling us that these things are bad and these things are wrong. And nothing is good or bad. Nietzsche wrote another book, Beyond Good and Evil. And that's what he said about himself. He says, I'm beyond good and evil. He was amoral, not immoral. He was not moral. He didn't have to be moral. He didn't have to have a standard. He only had to have his own standard. And so salvation just gets looked at like an emotional response. Ape ancestry also provided a covering for the sin of slavery. Think about it. Slaves were kidnapped. And if you tell yourself, if you tell yourself that people with darker skin and women and Chinese and Irish and a bunch of other, and Indonesian, a whole bunch of other people groups, but if you tell yourself that they're not as far on the evolutionary scale, it's a lot easier to enslave them, isn't it? And this happened just at the wrong time. Charles Darwin was publishing his books at just the wrong time in American history and for Americans to read. It provides a covering for the sin of slavery. Slaves were all kidnapped, and the Bible clearly tells us that kidnapping is punishable by death. You can't kidnap somebody. It's punishable by death. Christian, so-called Christian slave owners, and I think we all know they weren't Christians, got around this by convincing themselves that blackness was the curse of Cain, or that non-whites were only 3/5 human, as the US Constitution had upheld. We talked about this last week, Article 1, Section 2. Women and non-whites were not as developed as white males. Non-white males were not fully human. They were regarded as animals who could be traded and sold. Later, the dominant worldview would become social. And we mentioned this last week. For the Victorians, that is primarily English, but we did see the Victorian age here in America also. They spent their energies developing social programs to fix every social ill. In Britlit, we read She Stoops to Conquer by Oliver Goldsmith, and it illustrates this beautifully of what is wrong with the British, the European caste system, where people are in different classes of society. That class system, it's almost like a caste system. You have to marry somebody within your same class. The princesses can only marry princes. That's, of course, all fallen apart with the last couple of marriages. Christianity had sought to repair man from the inside out. Victorians attempt to fix us from the outside in. And this is what we always told the guys at McLaren. We volunteered at the boys' prison here in Oregon for 8 years in McLaren. And we'd tell these young men, this place, McLaren, all they can do is fix you from the outside in. You rack up bad points for swearing. You get bad points if you get in a fight. You get bad points for not going to school. You get all these bad points. And then you try to rack up good points. And then you can go into the special room that actually has some computer games to play. And only the guys who behave well get to go in there. And everybody else is out with all the rest of the community. But they can fix you from the outside in only. That's all they can do. And then we would tell them, God wants you to be reborn. He wants regeneration. He wants to change you from the inside out. And that's the easier, faster way. But at Victorians, we're trying to fix people from the outside in. And people today are still trying to do that. We do that here in Portland a lot, trying to fix people from the outside in. We think if we put everybody in a house, then everybody will be happy, and don't realize that the homeless, and there are plenty of homeless who are there because of bad circumstances and tragedy. But most of our homeless are either mentally ill or are addicted to drugs. And having a house will not help anybody who's addicted to drugs. We're struggling with that here in Portland right now. Homelessness is a big issue. How do you help people if they don't want help? There are people who want help, and those are the people you can help. But there will always be people who just don't want help, because we still have to choose. Freud and Nietzsche would blame every social ill on Christianity. Nietzsche interprets the fall of man in Genesis 3 in his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. He inverts the Christian interpretation. So he says, man refused to seek knowledge from the serpent. Remember, the serpent offered knowledge. He says, well, you refuse to seek knowledge from the serpent. Therefore, he'll later refuse to accept science. Same deal. He feels that Christianity is hostile to science. Christian symbols of the serpent and the eagle, what are they? Well, for Nietzsche, the serpent represents wisdom rather than evil, and the eagle represents pride. Amazing, isn't it? And this is what the ancient Greeks also practiced. What do snakes represent for Christians? Well, the serpent, Satan, and the eagle, the serpent represents Satan, and the eagle is a common metaphor for God. He'll spread his wings like an eagle. But is pride a sin? Yeah, pride's a big sin. What about self-esteem? It's interesting to note that pagan cultures adopted the serpent as a symbol of wisdom centuries ago. And there you have Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and curled under her shield, you see the snake, the serpent, the symbol of wisdom. Interesting, isn't it? But that's another class. That is classical lit. Nietzsche said, What is the greatest thing ye can experience? And he's trying to go all King James on you here. He's trying to make his words sound like the King James because he really thought his books would outsell the New Testament and he was going to change the world. So he says, what is the greatest thing ye can experience? It is the hour of great contempt, the hour in which even your happiness becometh loathsome unto you, and so also your reason and virtue. The hour of contempt is when you realize that your earlier ideals were petty and simple. Today we call that being woke. Thoreau calls this waking up. That's what he calls it, waking up. When they wake up and realize none of that stuff they were taught all their life and for the last 2,000 years is true, that they have to make their own meaning. Christians seek to discover truth through biblical absolutes. Nietzsche depicts meaning as something to be created. You've got to create your own meaning. You've got to create your own reality. Finally, the dominant worldview of our own culture has become fictitious. We each create our own reality, our own meaning, our own reality. Americans have always tended towards independence and individualism. What William Wordsworth had introduced, Emerson, Thoreau, and Walt Whitman had expanded. Okay, Henry David Thoreau. He was a naturalist, an essay writer, an environmentalist, a philosopher. Those are all good things. Combine that with a proper theology, and you've got a very interesting, well-educated person. Thoreau was 14 years younger than Emerson. Their friendship bloomed in the late 1830s after Thoreau's graduation from Harvard. Throughout the 1840s, Emerson encouraged Thoreau as a writer, praising his poetry and getting him started on the great topic of nature. They shared political attitudes about slavery. Their friendship cooled some in the 1850s, with Thoreau resenting Emerson's patronage and Emerson being critical of what he saw as Thoreau's lack of ambition. So Thoreau gets tired of living off of Emerson, and Emerson gets tired of Thoreau's laziness. We'll look at that quote from Walden on page 45 in just a few minutes. Ralph Waldo Emerson delivered the eulogy at Thoreau's funeral and said no truer American existed than Thoreau. Similar to the 1960s and the 1840s was an age of social experimentation. It saw a number of experiments with communal living. Nathaniel Hawthorne lived for a time at Brook Farm. The Alcotts lived at Fruitlands. If you have read some of Louisa May Alcott's books, think of Joe's Boys, where the boys are not all living with their own parents. They're all living with Joe and her husband because they are the enlightened ones. They're the transcendentalists and they're the educated ones. And so all the children are sent to them, the elite. And so it's rather a slam against a commoner like us. Excuse me. Thoreau's stay at Walden Pond is a more solitary introvert response to this same impulse toward social experimentation. He's just experimenting with what he can do with his life. He built a cabin on property owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he moved in on July 4th, 1845. He lived economically and comfortably for 2 years and 2 months. It was an experiment in self-reliance. And he says, and in our Dover edition, this is on page 59, this is an extremely important quote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life." Let's look. Have you turned to Dover page 59 yet? Dover page 59. There's some cool quotes here. I don't disagree with everything Thoreau wrote. I agree with a Christian interpretation. He says, "To be awake is to be alive. I've never yet met a man who was quite awake." And we would still use that today and say, you're not woke. We must learn to reawaken and keep ourselves awake. And then in the middle of the page, page 59, he says, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." And that's pretty cool. I don't want to die and find out I didn't live, my life wasn't worth anything. But of course, what is living life to me? What would be the most valuable thing that Thelma English wants? I want to glorify God with my life. I don't want to die and find out that I did not glorify God, that I lived to myself. So I do have an opposite opinion here. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner, to reduce it to its lowest terms, and if it proved to be mean, common, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, commonness, and publish its commonness, meanness to the world, or if it were sublime, to know it by experience and to be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. For most men, it appears to me, are in a strange uncertainty about it, whether it is of the devil or of God, and have somewhat hastily concluded that it is the chief end of man here to glorify God and enjoy him forever. He thinks we've kind of concluded hastily that that is our purpose here. Growing his own food and building his own shelter gave him freedom to work productively as a writer and a thinker. And he had this profound connection between self-reliance, meaningful labor, and thought. And he says, by working about 6 weeks in a year, I could meet all the expenses of living. If he worked for 6 weeks and then lived on this borrowed land and lived in the cabin that he built, then he could support himself. He'd have enough money to buy the few things that he needed, and he could support himself. I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. And that's from Civil Disobedience, which is a cool quote. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. Just because the machine is going the way that our world is going doesn't mean that we can't stand up against the tide. While living at Walden Pond, Thoreau was arrested and jailed overnight for not paying that poll tax. His essay on the experience, Civil Disobedience, explores the question of what a person should do when he or she feels that his government is acting immorally. And my favorite seminary professor, Dr. Carl Laney, said, count the cost. When he was teaching us the same lesson, he said, just count the cost. Randy Alcorn, famous author, prolific author, Christian author, picketed at an abortion clinic. Because he is a public figure, he was targeted, and I think it was an $8 million lawsuit against him. And he refused to pay that money to an abortion clinic. And so he gave everything that he owned away. He gave it all away so that he had nothing that they could sue him for. They had nothing to get. And he quit the pulpit at his church so that his church wouldn't be responsible for him and that his church couldn't be sued. And he lived for many, many years until they finally dropped the lawsuit. He lived with every dime that came from the sale of all of his books. Every dime went to different Christian ministries. He didn't keep any of it. He was allowed to keep minimum wage. Anything above minimum wage would be forfeited and given to the abortion clinic. So he lived on minimum wage for many years. So if you do decide to practice civil disobedience, be sure and count the cost. The Great Conversation. We have not had this discussion before. The Great Conversation, you can look it up. It's a phrase that gets used about all of the literature that's ever been written and how authors from a long time ago are conversing with authors. Authors now are conversing with them, looking back and conversing. If you write a paper about Emerson, what you like or don't like, or about Thoreau, what you like or don't like, you're part of that great conversation. It's almost like a quilt. It's almost like a giant quilt, and each little tiny piece in the quilt is an author, and they're touching many, many other authors who are inspired to become part of that great conversation. Mahatma Gandhi studied Thoreau's writings on civil disobedience as he led India's struggle for independence. Martin Luther King based many of his ideas of nonviolent action on the work of Gandhi, who was based on Thoreau and Emerson. Amazing, really, the influence that one writer can have on another writer. So open up your copy, get out your pen or your highlighter. Walden is all about extreme individualism. Page 1. I lived alone in the woods. I should not talk so much about myself if there were anybody else whom I knew as well. love that quote. Page 3. Thoreau quotes Matthew 6:19-21 from memory when he says, as it says in an old book. And then he quotes it, then blind obedience to a blundering oracle. Okay, now you know what Thoreau thinks about the Bible. It's right here in your Dover text, page 3. What does he think about the Bible? Not much. It's a blundering oracle in an old book. And I have all the cool things. It's near the top of the page on page 3. And then he talks a lot about Greek mythology. He studied a lot of Eastern religious things, and those all come up in this book too. So you may have to look some of the things up, but you don't need to. Thoreau sarcastically describes the divinity in man, the mass of men who lead lives of quiet desperation. This is another famous quote. And this is down near the bottom of the page, the second to the last paragraph. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. From the desperate city, you go into the desperate country to have to console yourself with the bravery of minks and muskrats. A stereotyped but unconscious despair is concealed even under what are called the games and amusements of mankind. There is no play in them, for this comes after work. But it is as a characteristic of wisdom not to do desperate things. When we consider what, to use the words of the Catechism, is the chief end of man, and of course this is from the Shorter Catechism in the New England Primer, and this is also mentioned on page 59. And what are the true necessities and means of life? It appears as if men had deliberately chosen the common mode of living, top of page 5. And he talks about what old people say you cannot do. You try and find that you can. Some old person tells you can't do that. You try and find you can. Old people did not know enough once. This is on page 5. Perchance to fetch fresh fuel to keep the fire going. New people put a little dry wood under a pot. I've lived, this is about the middle of the page, 5. I've lived some 30 years on this planet, and I have yet to hear the first syllable of valuable or even earnest advice from my seniors. They've told me nothing and probably cannot tell me anything to the purpose. Here is life, an experiment to a great extent untried by me, but it does not avail me that they have tried it. If I have any experience which I think valuable, I'm sure to reflect that this my mentor said nothing about. So he wants to do all the experimenting himself. And here is the site, and you can see people build cairns, little rock piles there when they go and visit Thoreau's site. And a great quote, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. It's a cool quote. No respect for elders. I just read that to you from page 5. He's lived some 30 years on this planet. He's 30 and he hasn't heard any wisdom from anybody old. Excuse me. The greater part of what my neighbors call good, this is from page 6, I believe in my soul to be bad. And if I repent of anything, it's very likely to be my good behavior. That's what he repents of, is his good behavior. What demon possessed me that I behaved so well? You may say the wisest thing you can, old man. You who have lived 70 years, not without honor of a kind, I hear an irresistible voice which invites me away from all that. One generation abandons the enterprises of another like stranded vessels. So he's not much for looking to mentors to help you along in life. He wants to start brand new and fresh. Confucius said, to know that we know what we know, and that we do not know what we do not know, that is true knowledge. And I believe that's gone all the way over into silliness. When one man has reduced a fact of the imagination to be a fact to his understanding, I foresee that all men at length establish their lives on that basis. Most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only not indispensable, but positively hindrances to the elevation of mankind. With respect to luxuries and comforts, the wisest have ever lived a more simple and meager life than the poor. And I think this is true. I think real wisdom shows that possessions actually can own you. If you have too many possessions, they own you. Life is very short to have so many possessions that you have to care for and worry about and protect and find a place to put and dust, oil and take care of. But to live a more simple life is better than to have maybe perhaps fewer things than poor people do. I often think that of collections, people who collect things, that they have to care for them and they're valuable and they're always looking for another, and it's an item that may own you. He continues, page 8 and 9. The ancient philosophers, Chinese, Hindu, Persian, and Greek, were a class than which none has been poorer in outward riches, none so rich in inward. And I think that would apply to Christians. Christians can possess all the books in the world, the biggest house to entertain and have people come over. But if you don't have the word in you, if you don't have time anymore to read the word of God and put that inside of you, what is everything else worth? Nothing. It's just keeping you busy, and you don't know how many years your life will be. Talking about noble and ignoble plants, he calls esculents, for example, carrots, and things that reach to the sky, well, for example, would be corn. Carrots go down and corn reaches for the sky. And he's got this metaphor on page 9 about vegetables and people, which is kind of funny. And he says, this is on page, excuse me. Let's see. Why has man, this is 2/3 of the way down the page, 9. Why has man rooted himself thus firmly in the earth, but that he may rise in the same proportion into the heavens above? For the nobler plants are valued for the fruit they bear at last in the air, and light far from ground, and are not treated like the humbler esculents, which would be the carrots that are pointed down into the earth. So the corn is more noble because it's reaching up high. The house Thoreau built, it was 10 by 15. We call that today a tiny house. A closet. It had a little garret and attic type space. It had 2 windows and he had a brick fireplace, and that's how he stayed warm. For more than 5 years, he says, I maintained myself thus solely by the labor of my hands. He was only in the little house 2 years, but for 5 years, he maintained himself solely by the labor of my hands. And I found that by working about 6 weeks in a year, I could meet all the expenses of living. The whole of my winters, as well as most of my summers, I had free and clear for study. So his work ethic is to work as little as possible. Although his focus is admirable for his simplicity, his thoughts are only for himself. He's only thinking about himself. Page 47. But all this is very selfish. I've heard some of my townsmen say, I confess that I have hitherto indulged very little in philanthropic enterprises, so giving to others, helping others. I've made some sacrifices to a sense of duty, and among others have sacrificed this pleasure also. There are those who have used all their arts to persuade me to undertake the support of some poor family in the town, and if I had nothing to do, for the devil finds employment for the idle, I might try my hand at some such pastime as that. As for doing good, that is one of the professions which are full. So there's already too many good do-gooders. Moreover, I have tried it fairly, and strange as it may seem, am satisfied that it does not agree with my constitution. He doesn't like to do good things, do good works. There is no odor so bad as that which arises from goodness tainted. It is human, it is divine carrion. If I knew for a certainty that a man was coming to my house with a conscious design of doing me good, I should run for my life as from that dry and parching wind of the African deserts called the simoon, which fills the mouth and nose and ears and eyes with dust till you're suffocated for fear that I should get some of his good done to me. Virus mingled with my blood. No, in this case, I would rather suffer evil the natural way. A man is not a good man to me because he will feed me if I should be starving, or warm me if I should be freezing, or pull me out of a ditch if I should ever fall into one. I can find you a Newfoundland dog that will do as much. Philanthropy is not love for one's fellow man in the broadest sense. Our manners have been corrupted by communication with the saints. Our hymn books resound with a melodious cursing of God and enduring him forever. One would say that even the prophets and redeemers had rather consoled the fears than confirmed the hopes of man. This, of course, is a horrible twisting of scripture. The Walden map, you can see that he's living almost near the Concord Bridge. The Walden Pond is on Emerson's property, and this is a very tiny place. He's in the midst of history. Page 55. But I would say to my fellows, once for all, as long as possible, live free and uncommitted. It makes but little difference whether you are committed to a farm or to the county jail. Moving into the cabin on July 4, when I first took up my abode in the woods, that is, began to spend my nights as well as days there, which by accident was on Independence Day or the 4th of July, 1845. My house was not finished for winter, but was merely a defense against the rain, without plastering or chimney, the walls being of rough, weather-stained boards with wide chinks, which made it cool at night. I was seated by the shore of a small pond, about 1.5 miles south of the village of Concord, and somewhat higher than it, in the midst of an extensive wood between that town and Lincoln, and about 2 miles south of that, our only friend, our only field known to fame, Concord Battleground. And of course, Emerson had written the Concord hymn. Every morning was a cheerful invitation to make my life of equal simplicity and, may I say, innocence with nature herself. I have been as sincere a worshiper of Aurora. Aurora is the goddess of the dawn. She brings the dawn in Greek mythology. I have been as sincere a worshiper of Aurora as the Greeks. And of course, to worship the Greek gods is just what Paul was talking against in Romans 1:20, where he says you're worshiping the creatures instead of the creator. I got up early and bathed in the pond. That was a religious exercise and one of the best things which I did. And that's beautiful, Walden Pond. It is a beautiful place. And of course, it's kept pristine in his memory. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. Make sure you mark up this quote. This is the one you must recognize. You have to know this is Henry David Thoreau from Walden. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear, nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. For most men, it appears to me, are in a strange uncertainty about it, whether it is of the devil or of God, and have somewhat hastily concluded that it is the chief end of man here to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And of course, that's from the Shorter Catechism, the Westminster Catechism. Simplicity, 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 I say. Let your affairs be as 2 or 3, not 100 or 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen and keep your accounts on your thumbnail. And so, live more simply. He's got some good advice here. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. I drink at it, but while I drink, I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. I would drink deeper, fish in the sky whose bottom is pebbly with stars. I cannot count one. I know not the first letter of the alphabet. I have always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born. And so this would be living simply, innocence. This is looking at that romantic idea of innocence replacing wisdom. He wishes he could go back and know nothing instead of everything he was taught. I've always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born. The intellect is a cleaver. So a cleaver is like an axe. It discerns and rifts its way into the secret of things. I do not wish to be any more busy with my hands than is necessary. My head is hands and feet. I believe that men are generally still a little afraid of the dark, though the witches are all hung and Christianity and candles have been introduced. These are great quotes. still age 85 again. Yet I experience sometimes that the most sweet and tender, the most innocent and encouraging society may be found in any natural object, even for the poor misanthrope and most melancholy man. So somebody really poor and doesn't like people and is sad and depressed all the time. There can be no very black melancholy to him who lives in the midst of nature and has his senses still. There are a lot of things Christians can get out of this. Sometimes when I compare myself with other men, it seems as if I were more favored by the gods than they, beyond any deserts that I am conscious of, as if I had a warrant and surety at their hands, which my fellows have not, and were especially guided and guarded. So he thinks the gods are with him. I do not flatter myself, but if it be possible, they flatter me. I have never felt lonesome or in the least oppressed by a sense of solitude, but once, and that was a few weeks after I came to the woods, when for an hour I doubted if the near neighborhood of man was not essential to a serene and healthy life. So for just an hour, he thought, maybe I need neighbors to be happy. And then he got over it. To be alone was something unpleasant, but I was at the same time conscious of a slight insanity in my mood and seemed to foresee my recovery. In the midst of a gentle rain, while these thoughts prevailed, I was suddenly sensible of such sweet and beneficent society in nature, in the very pattering of the drops, and in every sound and sight around my house, an infinite and unaccountable friendliness, all at once like an atmosphere sustaining me, as made the fancied advantages of human neighborhood insignificant, and I've never thought of them since. He got over being lonely really quick. Every little pine needle expanded and swelled with sympathy and befriended me. I was so distinctly made aware of the presence of something kindred to me, even in scenes which we are accustomed to call wild and dreary, and also that the nearest of blood to me in humanist was not a person nor a villager, that I thought no place could ever be strange to me again. I find it wholesome to be alone the greater part of the time. To be in company, even with the best, is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. Society is commonly too cheap. We meet at very short intervals, not having had time to acquire any new value for each other. We meet at meals 3 times a day and give each other a new taste of that old musty cheese that we are. We have had to agree on a certain set of rules called etiquette and politeness to make this frequent meeting tolerable, and that we need not come to open war. We meet at the post office and at the sociable and about the fireside every night. We live thick and are in each other's way and stumble over one another, and I think that we thus lose some respect for one another. Certainly less frequency would suffice for all important and hearty communications. I have a great deal of company in my house, especially in the morning when nobody calls. This is one of my favorite quotes. I have a great deal of company in my house, especially in the morning when nobody calls, on page 89. Let me suggest a few comparisons that someone may convey an idea of my situation. I am no more lonely than the loon in the pond that laughs so loud, or than Walden Pond itself. I have occasional visits in the long winter evenings when the snow falls fast and the woods and the wind howls in the wood, from an old settler and original proprietor who is reported to have dug Walden Pond and stoned it and fringed it with pine woods, who tells me stories of old time and of new eternity. And betwixt us, we manage to pass a cheerful evening with social mirth and pleasant views of things, even without apples or cider, a most wise and humorous friend whom I love much. An elderly dame, too, dwells in my neighborhood. And he's talking about this elderly lady, but he means Mother Nature, dwells in my neighborhood, invisible to most persons, in whose odorous herb garden I love to stroll sometimes, gathering simples and listening to her fables, for she has a genius of unequaled fertility, and her memory runs back farther than mythology. And she can tell me the original of every fable, and on what fact every one is founded, for the incidents occurred when she was young. A ruddy and lusty old dame, and lusty, a couple hundred years ago, meant healthy. They used to call babies, they would say a baby who was crying, a lusty babe. That meant he was healthy. He had a really strong cry. He's not going to die in infancy. A ruddy and lusty old dame who delights in all weathers and seasons and is yet likely to outlive all her children. Thoreau decides that it is time that the tables were turned. And he actually says that on page 98. It's time that the tables were turned. Does that bring back memory of anything special we've been looking at lately? Yes, the poem of the friend, the person that he admires, William Wordsworth, who wrote The Tables Turned. Up, up, my friend, and quit your books, or surely you'll grow double. Up, up, my friend, and clear your looks. Why all this toil and trouble? The sun above the mountain's head, a freshening luster mellow, through all the long green fields has spread his first sweet evening yellow. Books, 'tis a dull and endless strife. Come, hear the woodland linnet. How sweet his music, on my life. There's more of wisdom in it. And hark how blithe the throstle sings. He too is no mean preacher, and mean means common. He's no common preacher. Come forth into the light of things. Let nature be your teacher. She has a world of ready wealth, our minds and hearts to bless, spontaneous wisdom breathed by health, truth breathed by cheerfulness. One impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can. It's a pretty cool poem. Sweet is the lore which nature brings. Our meddling intellect misshapes the beauteous forms of things we murder to dissect. Enough of science and of art. Close up those barren leaves. So slap goes your book closed. Close up those barren leaves. Come forth and bring with you a heart that watches and receives. And that's the end of our session today. Enjoy reading Walden. I think there are things in Walden that a Christian can appreciate and enjoy and underline and use and throw away all the rest. Do become familiar with Thoreau, with Walden. Enjoy it. Enjoy your project. I hope that perhaps I'll even hear from some of you about your project. Lord bless you. Bye.